And here's Andrew Carlson with the latest installment in his famous Jubilees project. Ta-da!
Hey guys, sorry for the long delay. I plan on being more consistent with this going forward. We're going to try to do this every week. Looks like we're going to be doing it on Wednesdays still, but if we need to, we can pick a better time for Jackson, but that's what it seems like for now. That's what we're going to do. And
It's
so, yeah, we left off last time. I know it's been a while, but we left off last time with basically Abraham kicked the bucket and he died. And what was really cool that we talked about last time is how Jubilees, I believe, is the source of the whole Abraham's bosom thing in the Gospel of Luke. I found that a very interesting connection. So that's kind of where we left off. So now we're pretty much going to get into the story of Jacob, and we'll see how far we get today. We're going to have a little less time today because we started a little bit later, but I'll try to get through as much as I can. So one sec here. Okay, so for some reason I feel like I talked about this, but I don't think I did in the last. Even if I did, I'm going to mention it again. So basically, we're right now chapter 24, and what's interesting is Jubilees many times gives unique details that are not found in Genesis, even in the same stories. So yeah, I feel like we did do this, but I'll cover this quickly because it seems like from my memory, I feel like we talked about this already. But what I found interesting when comparing Jubilees and Genesis is that Esau basically sells his birthright, according to Genesis, right? But we don't really know why he did that. He just seems like he was being stupid. But Jubilees explains that there's a context to this, and that the context is that there was a famine. And so that meant there was a shortage of food available. So Esau's hunger wasn't exclusively limited to him just being, it wasn't limited to him being like a glutton for food, and he cared more about food than his birthright. He sincerely believed that he might die and he needed some food. So he knew that it made more sense to give away his birthright and eat food than to die, and then he would lose his birthright anyway. But that was, Jubilees presents this, as a lack of faith on Esau's part. Because if Esau had faith, he would have known, what Messiah said in the Gospels. He said, do not worry about the food you will eat. He will provide for you. That's a paraphrase, but, the ones of faith don't get too worked up over this. They will have faith and wait patiently to find the food. And some people might, as I said, I think last time, some people might feel very many times people present Jacob as like an evil guy or like a sneaky, conniving man that was deceptive and a liar and not exactly the most righteous patriarch. That's how people present Jacob. Jubilees presents a very different picture. It presents Jacob as a hallmark of righteousness. The only flaws that Jubilees doesn't really touch upon this, but the only flaws really of Jacob's life would be the whole issue of, well, there's a couple things Jubilees mentions that Jacob did wrong, but it doesn't present those as so much willful sin on Jacob, sins of ignorance on Jacob's part. And so it presents all the deception presented in Genesis that Esau did. Jubilees praises that and says that was a good thing. So it's a very unique perspective towards Jacob's activities. And Nazarene Acts shares that perspective of Jacob being a righteous man. It says in the Nazarene Acts, Peter does not believe anything against the righteous mentioned in Scripture. So anything that paints the patriarchs in a sinful light, he doesn't believe it. Because you can't, according to Scriptures, you can't be a righteous, faithful man if you're living in willful sin. So if Scripture seems to present someone as a willful sinner, then clearly either that man was not righteous and was not faithful, or the Scriptures corrupt. And Peter went to the perspective of that the Scriptures are corrupt in certain places because it misrepresents the character of the patriarchs. And that's exactly what Genesis does. Genesis misrepresents the character of many of the patriarchs. But Jubilees gives the full context of the good qualities of the patriarchs and why the patriarchs did certain things. And so I'm going to touch upon that a little bit later. But now, another interesting thing is, some people say that Esau's name was changed to Edom because he was born with red hair. But Jubilees tells us that he was named it not because of the hair, but because of the red pottage, which Jacob gave him for his birthright. So it's kind of like, the story of Lot's daughters, which is his two daughters he slept with, and they had kids with him. Through, of course, they made him drunk, but basically that doesn't excuse it. Jubilees doesn't excuse Laban's behavior for that. Jubilees lays blame to Laban as well as the daughters. And so the reason I mention that is the names of the daughters have a special meaning. And the meaning is kind of a little bit gross, but you just got to imagine what it would sound like if you're living in ancient Israel and you hear these names. It would be crazy. So the names are Moab. the people. I have a little bit of a cough, so excuse me. The Moabites are the descendants of Moab, and the Ammonites are the descendants of Ammon or Ben-Ami, Ben-Ammoni or something. Anyways, those names mean in Hebrew, Moab means from father or from dad, and Ammon, or I think how it's worded in Genesis is Ammoni, which is son of my people. So you basically got the Moabites, which are basically, whenever Israel heard that, whenever the Jews in the ancient times talked about the Moabites, they said, yeah, so I'm going to use a little strong language here, okay? Just a disclaimer here. So, in English, if someone says motherfucker, it's kind of what they would hear in Hebrew, but instead it would be fatherfucker. It's not, it has that same harshness, of like grotesqueness. That's what Moabite meant from dad. That was like a disgusting from. Oh, those are the from dad people. You know, that was a very shameful thing to be known for. That was their name, and it was a disgraceful thing. And the same thing with from my people. Oh, those are the from my people. Those are the incest people. That's the incest people. That's like, wow. That's like basically like haunting. The name given to them is like a mockery of how ridiculous what they did was. In the same way, Edom is a mockery of the man Esau for what happened in his life. It's, haha, you're no longer named Esau. You're named Red because like it's almost like ready, like you know, like if someone uses like a nickname almost like to make fun of someone. That's kind of what it was here, where he started to be known as Edom because it was a constant reminder of how silly what he did was. But it seems like he owned the name. Although I have to wonder, I haven't seen this. Let's see here. Whoa, okay. So I'm doing a find and search in the I'm doing a find and search in Jubilees right now. And so it's funny because it says this is way later, but in chapter 36, verse 19, it says, "And Esau went to the land of Edom." What? That kind of sounds funny because like did he call it the land of Edom already, or did it come to have that name later after he died? So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. From what I can tell, there's not clear evidence that he was actually called Edom in his lifetime. It seems like he was called Edom after he died, because it's unlikely that Jacob would call his own brother, like would make fun of him like that. Like, you red guy, haha. You know, I don't think he would do that. Maybe he would, but I don't think that's what he would do. But it makes sense for people from later generations to call him the red guy. And then for later generations to own that name. It's like, yeah, whatever. And then they just come to be known by that. I'm just going to quickly check. I'm checking the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs to see if Edom is there. So the Testaments, although it's been altered by the Christian scribes to a shortened text, it only has Esau in it, it looks like. So it appears that in the lifetime of the patriarchs, he was not called Edom at all. So Edom seems to be a way later statement. So what we know, according to Jubilees, is that by the time of Moses, they were known as the Edomites. So sometime from the time that Esau died and Moses was born, they came to be known as the red people. Okay. Excuse me. Yeah, just a couple days ago, I got a cold, so I'm kind of still getting over that. So now it says 24 verse 7, at this time, Jacob became the elder, and Esau was brought down from his dignity. So this was not just selling the birthright was an official legal thing. It truly meant that Esau was no longer the firstborn. He was no longer to be considered the firstborn anymore. although biologically, yeah, he was, legally he was not. It's just like if you adopt someone, they're not biologically your son, but if you adopt someone, they're your legal firstborn. So if they're the oldest, they're your legal firstborn. And we know from scripture there's a high emphasis on legality, legal lineage. Like, for example, if your brother dies without a descendant, his nearest relative that is able to fulfill the duty to his brother is supposed to marry the widow of the person that died in the family. And this could be fulfilled by cousins. I don't know if it was necessarily fulfilled by actual brothers. By the time of Moses, from what I see in the Torah, by the time of Moses, it was not acceptable to, according to the Torah, a man is not allowed to sleep with a woman who has slept with his brother in any point of their lifetime. So in the passage which talks about the brother marrying the widow, I think that that's actually referring to cousins, because in the Hebrew, brothers has a wider meaning. It actually has a meaning more like relatives, from what like brother, but in the sense of relative. And it's most commonly used for brothers and sisters, but from what I can tell, it's also used for cousins. But if someone disagrees with that, maybe they could show me contrary evidence. That's what I've seen. And so the Jubilees tells us that because the famine was all over the place, Isaac went down into Egypt. And he went to the king of the Philistines, unto Abimelech. And Genesis gives the fuller detail of how Isaac deceives Abimelech about his wife as well. Let me go to that passage again. I'm going to go to Genesis just to see. All right. Let's see here. Sorry about the noise in the background. Okay. All right. So what's also weird is that Abraham did this to Abimelech as well, and then Isaac did the same thing. So it's weird that both Abraham and Isaac pulled the same trick on Abimelech, unless it is possible that they're two different kings by the same name, because we know that happens sometimes in some nations. The king has a son, and the son has the same name as the previous king. So that may explain why there's seemingly strange thing of Abimelech getting deceived by both Abraham and Isaac in the same ruse. Because it doesn't make sense for Abimelech to learn the lesson and then to do it again with Isaac. But if there's two different ones, that makes sense. One sec here. Anyway, Isaac calls Rebecca his sister, when in reality, she's not his actual sister, but she is a close relative. So, now, do any of you guys have, right now, Jubilees, like a translation of Jubilees on hand right now? I want you guys to check something for me. It doesn't have to be all of you, just one of you. Anyone want to check for me? Tell me in the comment section, the chat, or you can talk with your microphone and tell me if you're willing to check for me. Because I see an error, and I want to see if it's in other versions or if it's just in this version that I'm following.
Give me just a sec. I don't have a great translation, but let me grab it. I can't find my online link. I just looked.
What is your version like? Is it Charles or someone else? While she looks for that, I'm going to continue. So, Jubilees gives us details of chronology. Genesis often doesn't tell us how long the patriarchs did certain things. So it's very ambiguous time-wise. So you could have a lot of interpretations of how long the chronology was. But Jubilees is very specific. It says, no, it was this and this and this and this. So it tells us that Isaac was living in the land of Abimelech for 21 years. 3 weeks of years, it says. Jubilees skips over the story, but alludes to it. Okay, you got Charles' translation? So I want you to look up for me what it says for 24 verse 12. And can you read it or spell it? Whichever is the case.
Sure, hang on.
All right, 24 verse 12. I'm bringing attention to this because I want people to understand that errors happen, especially with the Bible, but not just, the regular books, but also even some of these extra books are sometimes errors. So you got to be careful with these books.
Okay, 24:12 says, I'm not sure if this is the one you want or if this is numbered differently. It says, and he dwelt in Gerar 3 weeks of years.
Yeah, that's what I wanted.
Okay, Gerar.
All right, good. The version online that I'm using says he dwelt in Gerar 3 weeks of years. So I'll post it. It's Summa Scriptura website. And on that website, it says Gerar. But you just read from Charles' translation in your physical copybook, and it says Gerar, right?
Yes, sir.
So this is a minor discrepancy, but it just shows that errors can creep in the process of scribal work. And this was an accident. Someone loaded it, someone copied and pasted, probably. And I don't know how this happened, but somehow it became an L instead of. So it's just interesting to see things like that. Now, some people try to say that Jubilees omitted certain stories because they thought it didn't make the patriarchs look good. The story in particular that Jubilee skips over is, as I said, Isaac's deception about his wife Rebecca. However, Jubilees does allude to it in verse 13 when it says, Abimelech charged concerning him, and concerning all that was his, saying, any man that shall touch him or aught that is his shall surely die. So that's an allusion to that story. But I think the reason Jubilees skips over the story, it skips over all three instances of the story. Not once. The first two times Abraham did it, it doesn't mention it. And when Isaac does it, it doesn't mention it either. And I think it's because it's not considered particularly relevant. It's basically it doesn't Jubilees has a big focus of it's covering the story of these lives, but of these people's lives, but for the primary purpose of establishing the law, the origin of the law.
Question?
And covenant. Yeah, sure.
What if the people who transmitted this to us considered that particular action of both those patriarchs as something that would be unclean or impure, so they didn't include it? And that would give you a real hint as to who made this, because there was at a certain period in time in history, the people of Israel, or some of them, were really wanting to get back to more stringent purity laws. What do you think? Interesting?
That's what some people have said, but I don't find that particularly compelling, mainly because I don't think Jubilees was made to be read in isolation to the Genesis story. It was made to be read in harmony with, in conjunction with the whole story of Genesis and the Genesis Apocrypha. So the thing is, when you're making a book that's a condensed version of a longer story, you only want to include the most important parts. So, like, for example, when Genesis says in chapter 6, it talks about the sons of God came down to the woman and had relations and had giants and Nephilim. It's a very brief rendering of the story, but they don't skip over the story. And you would think that if they didn't like that story, they wouldn't have even mentioned it. The fact that they mentioned the Nephilim story shows that they agreed with it, but that they thought it wasn't particularly relevant for their reason of why they were writing the book. So they simply alluded to the story. But the Genesis, from what I can tell, the author of Genesis was focusing on the origin of Israel as a familial, genealogical origin, the family history. So it wasn't considered particularly relevant, all that stuff the angels did. Like, there's a lot of information about all the Watchers and everything they did, but not very relevant to the history of Israel as a nation coming into creation. Whereas Jubilees focuses on the legal law aspects, the ritual aspects, and Enoch's information is particularly relevant in that regard for the calendar. So Jubilees focuses on calendar aspects as well as the very specific laws of Noah and the Enochian concepts. So I just think that they have two very different perspectives. So from the perspective of the family origin, it's an amazing story to talk about how Abraham and Isaac had to tell them that their spouse was just their sister, but in reality they were also a spouse. So that's a very interesting and enlightening story to give fuller context to the family history. But it's not so relevant for determining law and order. So that's why I think Jubilee skips over. I could be wrong on that, but I'm kind of inclined to think that, especially since it makes the allusion to the story. Because in in Genesis, it says, where is it? In verse 11, chapter 26 of Genesis, it says, "And Abimelech charged all his people, saying, Every man that touches this man and his wife shall be liable to death." This verse comes right after that story. So it's the conclusion of the story, that verse. Jubilees has that conclusion. It just skips over the whole story and basically just says, oh, by the way, that happened. Yeah, we move on. That's kind of the way it approaches it. So it says so in Jubilees it says, he dwelt in Gerar 3 weeks of years, and Abimelech charged concerning him and concerning all that was his, saying, Any man that shall touch him or aught that is his shall surely die. Now that's an interesting difference, because Genesis says, well, I was reading from the Septuagint, so let me quickly check the Masoretic text here. I always like looking at the small differences because it shows evidence of scribal corruption over time. And Jubilees was clearly based on a different text than Genesis, but a similar text. So it's very relevant to compare the difference, the differences between the two versions. So, 1 second here. Looks like we lost. Did you guys see when the other guy left? Let's see here. All right, so.
Oh, I thought he went to get his Jubilees.
I don't know. But maybe he'll be back.
It's only been a minute or two. He might have just gotten up.
Oh, yeah, that could be. So the Masoretic and Septuagint, they both have, he who touches his man or his wife shall surely be put to death. But Jubilees says, any man that shall touch him or aught that is his shall surely die. So Jubilees spreads it out wider and doesn't say just his wife, but anything that's his. If you harass him and touch anything that's his, you will die. And right after he says that, it tells us that Isaac's had lots of possessions. And another interesting thing, it says, in Isaac's, this is in Genesis. So in Genesis it says, and Isaac sowed in that land, and he found in that year barley in hundredfold, and the Lord blessed him. And the man was exalted in advancing. He increased till he became very great. And he had cattle of sheep and cattle of oxen and many tilled lands, and the Philistines envied him. Now, you look at Jubilees, and it says, and Isaac waxed strong among the Philistines, and he got many possessions, oxen and sheep and camels and asses and a great household. And he sowed in the land of the Philistines and brought in 100-fold. And Isaac became exceedingly great, and the Philistines envied him. So it sounds similar, and it very much is, but what's interesting is that the clauses are reversed in the order. Jubilees has the clauses in a separate order. So again, it's not particularly relevant for establishing doctrine, but it is relevant for showing evidence that the Torah has been altered over time. And once you start accumulating all this evidence, the textual evidence, you see, wow, what we have in the Bible is not the original Torah. It is a copy of it that's been edited over time. So that is very important because it helps us approach the scriptures from a more realistic perspective. Now, instead of viewing every word, every letter as the perfect word of God, Now we're viewing it as, okay, the original may have been perfect, perhaps, but what we have now is not perfect, and it's been changed and interpreted by men. So that's kind of the significance of some of these more minuscule differences. And of course, there's so many more differences that I haven't covered, but some of the differences are more minor, like Jubilees will sometimes have a the, and Genesis doesn't have a the. You know, those are very minor typically. So I'm not exhaustively going through everything in Jubilees. I'm just kind of touching on the main points in these series. Okay. So let's see here. So near the end, we're told that near the end of chapter 24, we're told that Isaac knew that day that under constraint he had sworn to them to make peace with them, that is, the Philistines. And Isaac on that day cursed the Philistines and said, "Cursed be the Philistines until the day of wrath and in indignation from the midst of all nations. May God make them a derision and a curse and an object of wrath and indignation in the hands of the sinners, the Gentiles, and in the hands of whoever escapes the sword of the enemy." This is unclear if Jacob's talking or if Jubilees is talking now. The angel, or is Jacob talking? Or Isaac, or Isaac. It's not clear in the text. So it goes on to talk about the Kittim. And you know what's interesting? The Dead Sea Scrolls talk about the Kittim. That's a very important theme, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Kittim. And so we have prophecy in Jubilees about the Kittim. And I don't think you see that in Genesis. You don't see the Kittim mentioned. So that's another connection with the Dead Sea Scrolls. We've already discussed how much Jubilees agrees with the Dead Sea Scrolls in so many striking ways. So, now, the reason he was so angry with the Philistines that he cursed them is because they treated them harshly regarding the wells, and it was very hateful and wrathful towards Isaac, and it was kind of like a betrayal of Isaac. So that's why he cursed them. Now it's interesting that he talks about the Kittim as the ones who punish Philistines. I wonder if Jacob knew the Kittim as people different than who, the Dead Sea Scrolls seems to interpret Kittim as the Romans. But Rome, I don't think, existed in the time of Jacob when he said the Kittim. So Jacob might have had someone else in mind when he said Kittim.
Or originally, it was Cyprus.
Oh, yeah?
Yes, way back, Cyprus was under the thumb of some other empire. I can't remember which one, but Kittim was the original. So it could be anybody up there, really.
Yeah, I mean, now, is Cyprus connected with Greece or no?
Yes, definitely. It still is.
Because you could say, because, Roman kind of got absorbed, like Roman kind of came out of the Greece in some ways, in many ways. So that could be a connection there. So and it says no remnant shall be left of the Philistines, nor one that shall be saved on the day of the wrath of judgment. For destruction and rooting out and expulsion from the earth is the whole seed of the Philistines. And there shall no longer be left for these Kaphtorim a name or seed on the earth. So that's a pretty harsh curse here. And I will be honest with you, I'd have to study this more to try to understand the depth of why the curse was so harsh with the Philistines. But regardless, this is just evidence that, curses are not entirely foreign to the nature of God, the Creator, Elohim. The Messiah says, "Bless those who curse you, and pray for those who persecute you, or whatever. And love your enemies." But notice, he does not say don't curse people, and he does not say don't hate people. He says love people and bless people who are your enemies. But he does not say don't curse them and don't hate them, because in my studies, I have found that you can love someone and hate them at the same time, and you can bless them and curse them at the same time. And how is that possible? Because you love them for a specific reason, and you hate them for a specific reason. You might love them because they are not, they have a good quality in this way, but you might hate them because they have a bad quality in another way. You might bless them because you want good things to happen to them. You want them to be saved, or you want them to become righteous. You want them to repent. You don't want them to suffer. You don't want them to suffer at the hands of sinners. Like, you don't want someone to be murdered, for example. I wouldn't wish murder upon anyone. I wouldn't wish rape upon anyone, even the most evil people. At the same time, I want justice, so I also curse people who are evil, and I want them to be punished for what they've done. So you can have hope for someone to not be wronged. Two wrongs don't make a right type thing. So you bless them in that you don't want wrong to be done to them. You don't want them to be wronged, but you curse them because you want the wrongs to be made right. And how does that happen? Through punishment, either through human punishment, through the government, or divine punishment through nature, or the judgment day, the day of judgment. So I don't think there's a contradiction in the message of the New Testament and with something like Jubilees, which talks about cursing. And even in the Torah says you will go a mountain and say, curses the person who lays with this person, curses the person who does this. There's a whole curse for what people do. And let's see here. I feel like we did this last time. So I'm gonna have to our next video. I'm gonna make sure that I'm not covering the same thing over and over again. So I'm gonna rewatch the last couple of videos to make sure I'm on the right part before I do the next one. But even if I repeated the same information, I still think I brought some new stuff that I didn't in the previous one. So I don't think it's a waste here. But I do
definitely. You threw some things in there that I sure never knew that I'm going to remember. Like I think identity of Edom and Moab. I think that's important, and also the cousin thing, because that transfers directly to what I'm interested in, and that's the New Testament.
What do you think in terms of the cousin for that?
Well, you see, you've got the word adelphoi, brothers, and if we take that literally, then Yeshua has like 5 brothers.
Yeah.
Is that possible? I think probably some of those are not brothers, they're cousins, because of the close-knit family there. And I think that you made a real good point there with that passage you used concerning the cultural use of that word. I mean, of course, that's Greek I'm talking about, but they're both the same thing there.
Yeah, they overlap. So I can say a few more things to wrap up, because I can kind of give like a preview of what's to come type thing. But I do want to say about the curses. What's interesting, there's a few more verses here. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, just referring to curse passages. It says, this is in 25 verse 21. This is Rebecca talking to Jacob, saying, "Blessed be he that blesseth thee, and all flesh that curseth thee falsely, may it be cursed." So it's interesting. It says, Rebecca's saying, those who bless you, may they be blessed. Anyone who curses you falsely, may they be cursed. So that implies that if they curse you truly, then it's okay. If they curse you falsely, then they should be cursed. So it's definitely like pro-curse. It's not, people who come from Christianity are not used to this concept of cursing is good. And so...
Well, look, Paul cursed people.
Yeah, if you're going to follow Paul, yeah.
Old Paul, yeah.
Of course, as they say for Paul, you know, I do not what I understand or whatever. You know, they quote that passage. So apparently Paul was a horrible sinner. According to Christianity, they say Paul was the worst of sinners, of whom I am chief. Do you know that passage, Jackson? There's a passage that says something like, in one of Paul's letters, it's like a little saying. It sounds like a saying of Christians that was being used at the time when Paul wrote the letter. And he said something like, may sinners be saved, of whom I am chief. So people will take that and say, oh, Paul was the chief of sinners.
One thing we can tell about him is that by his own admission, he didn't lie. He said that enough times. I don't lie. And then he says, I don't boast, but let me boast about this.
Yeah.
I want to write this book on Paul. I got it all outlined and everything. I just didn't have a title for it. And I was talking to my aunt the other day. We were talking about this book. And she said, why don't you call it The Apostle Paul, The Dirt? I thought, the dirt? You know how you dig up dirt on people?
Yeah.
That's not my intention, but I thought, wow, that's quite a catchy title.
Yep.
Yeah,
I'll use it though.
My dad, you know how he you and him, I think you guys are still Facebook friends. And he kind of like shook his head or rolled his eyes when he saw one of the things long ago. It was you know, on the on your show you have like a little recording thing where it says something like the apostate Paul.
I throw that in for a laugh once in a while.
Yeah.
He heard that, huh?
Your
dad's a pretty religious guy.
Yeah, I would say of my family, he's, other than me, I would say he's religious. My older brother comes close to it, though, but the rest of my family is kind of more up in the air. Yeah, so, but I, you know, it's kind of like a play on words, you know, Apostle Paul, apostate Paul, so it's kind of, you know, a clever little thing you have there. Now, I think I'll close by this, because this is gonna be what we're talking about next time, and that's deception. So, from what I can tell, Scripture as well as philosophy makes a distinction between lying and deception, and Jubilees capitalizes on this and presents the whole story of Jacob's deception in a very different way. I'll give you the brief version here. Basically, Genesis has, let me just make sure I got this right. Okay, so Genesis has it as, and I'll talk about this next time, but it has this is when Jacob is trying to trick his father to make him think that he's Esau, so that he can get the blessing of the firstborn. And Rebecca helps him out in doing that. So let's see. Okay. So it says in Genesis, "Here I am. Who are you, my son?" Jacob said to his father, "I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done just as you told me." Then Isaac said to Jacob, "Please come near so that I may feel you, my son, whether you are really my son Esau or not." And then verse 24, it says, "Then he said, 'Are you really my son Esau?' He said, 'I am.'" Jubilees renders it slightly differently. Jubilees has it as let's see here. "I am thy firstborn, thy son Esau. I have done as thou hast commanded me." Then, no wait, whoopsie, a little bit earlier. Hold on. Sorry. I just read at Esau's part, my bad. So, okay. It says, he said, "I am thy son," and then it says, and he said, "Art thou my son Esau?" And he said, "I am thy son." So, Jubilees has Jacob replying, "I am thy son," whereas Genesis has it as, "I am thy son Esau." So the deception is more clear in Genesis, whereas Jubilees makes Esau more careful with makes Jacob more careful with his words, so that he's not lying, but that he's being he's withholding information, but he's not lying. So it's just interesting the way Jubilees definitely portrays it differently. So either the author or scribes of Jubilees did not like the idea that Jacob lied, and they reworded it to make it more deception and not lying. So, but I'm going to go more into this next time. There's a lot of interesting things about it that I can cover. So we'll get into that next time. Did anyone have any final questions?
No, just thank you. I'm glad you're back.
Yeah, and we'll, as I said, we'll try to do this. Not try. We will do this every Wednesday.
Good job. I enjoyed it.
All right. Thanks,
Learned a
guys.
lot. All right. Next time.
Shalom. Have a good night.